Let's answer the haters. Good morning, guys. Welcome back to the channel. So for today's video, I wanted to answer a lot of the haters that I'm seeing more and more online. It sure does seem like in the last, probably year or so, maybe longer than that, but for me, I've noticed the last year or so on social media and even face-to-face, more and more EV haters out there. And so I wanted to answer them in this video. It seems like I spend quite a bit of time on Facebook and other platforms addressing downright incorrect information or data that a lot of people, that form a lot of people's opinions regarding electric cars. So let me start by saying welcome. My name is Matt. This is Tech Forum. On this channel, I discuss primarily the ownership experience of living long-term, putting a lot of miles on a long-range Tesla Model 3. This car has just shy of 30,000 miles on it. I had a previous one that I put 111,000 miles on before I traded in on this car. To give you a bit of my background, where I'm coming from, I'm not necessarily an expert on the topic, but I'm 51 years old, so I've been driving for 35 years, and pretty much since day one, I've driven a lot of miles. When I was a teenager, I started delivering pizzas. I also had a job that was almost an hour drive from my home, and I've just always driven a lot of miles. In the 35 years that I've been driving, I've driven over 1.1 million miles. And in that time, as you can imagine, I've owned many, many cars. And most of them gas cars, obviously, because EVs have really only become a thing recently, in recent years. But I've had many standard hybrids. My wife's daily driver is a plug-in hybrid. And I've had a handful of EVs. I have owned 4 EVs. We currently have another EV on order. We currently own, we own 5, well, anyway, that's subject for another video, but I have put 250,000 miles on EVs alone. I also, before I had electric cars, I was designing and manufacturing ultra high-end electric bicycles. Goodness, I've built a lot of electric vehicles. I also have a second business that I make high-end upgrades for those one-wheeled electric skateboards, which are electric, and used to be in the electric helicopter radio control industry. So I've worked with electric propulsion for a long time, and again, about 250,000 miles of electric miles driven in electric cars that I've done personally. So I at least have personal experience knowledge to share. So what I wanted to do in this video was address the primary objections that EV haters have. And I actually have my cheat sheets here, primarily because, honestly, I'm never going to remember all of the information that I wanted to share today. So the first subject that people seem to bring up is that coal powers EVs, and there's a lot of truth to that. So right off the bat, there is some validity to that argument. Now, I did some research, and these numbers are readily available. You can go ahead and Google it. And I read government websites, I've read independent research websites, and here are some of the numbers that I found. And these are generalities. There are going to be outliers, cases that are extremely better or cases that are extremely worse, but this is sort of the average. And this is taking 250 watt hours per mile as an average power consumption for an EV. This car, I'm currently averaging 266 watt hours per mile. This is a performance Model 3, and honestly, I floor this car a lot. So, well, I floor it occasionally anyway, so this car is less efficient. My last Tesla, I got 221 watt hours per mile, 222. But all the EVs we've had personally have been 250 watt hours per mile or less. And I took the government's average fuel economy, which as of 2022, the average fuel economy was like 31.6 miles per gallon. I just rounded it up to 32 for the sake of these numbers. So coal powers EVs. Yes, it does. in a lot of areas. Now, 56% of U.S. Power is produced by coal, by burning coal. Now, the other 44% isn't renewables. It's a mix between natural gas, oil, and renewables. About 20%, it's 20.1% of U.S. power is produced by renewable sources, be it solar or wind power or other renewable sources. But based just on coal production, since that's the majority of power produced, if you crunch all the numbers, which there's a lot to this as far as how many miles that a car drives per pound of coal, and how many miles a gas car goes per pound of gasoline, and all that, it was a little complex. But after working the numbers for a while, it wasn't hard to come up with a solution. So what I've come up with here is, when you kind of boil all the numbers down, you've got for an electric car, you've got a half a pound of CO2 is produced by burning coal per mile to drive in an electric car. So for every mile I drive this car, there's about half a pound. I believe it was 0.53 pounds of CO2 produced per mile that I drive this EV. Now, with a gas car, again, taking 32 miles per gallon, which is a little bit generous on my part, on average gas mileage for gas car, and that's for 2022. This isn't taking into account older cars that get far worse mileage. The actual average miles per gallon for cars, historically is way worse than this, because there are older cars getting 6 miles to the gallon, lots and lots of cars getting in the teens. This is for brand new cars produced in 2022. 32 miles per gallon is the average, and there is 0.61 pounds of CO2 produced by tailpipe emissions per mile that a gas car is driven. Now, that doesn't take into account transportation cost for that fuel, or production CO2 manufactured in the production of that gasoline. This is just tailpipe emissions only. So when you look at the numbers, it's actually far worse than this, but I'm being as anti-EV as I can and as pro-gas car as I possibly can, in order to give the EV haters as much ammunition as I possibly can. But even skewing the numbers as much as I can toward the gas car positive, there's still about 20% more CO2 produced per mile of driving in a gas car than there is in an EV. And again, when you look at things like the fact that there are older cars that are producing way more CO2 than modern cars, this skews the numbers to roughly 2 to 1, where there's about twice as much CO2 per mile driving in a gas car versus an EV. But an EV does produce CO2 when you drive. Now, that's taking just coal into consideration. 20.1%, as I mentioned earlier, of electricity production in this country is produced by renewables. And therefore, that doesn't produce any CO2. I mean, it took, you had to manufacture the renewable power plants and all that, the solar panels and the windmills, but you had to produce the power plants, the coal power plants too. So I'm not taking plant production into account here, just power production after the plants are built, because there's CO2 being produced to manufacture either of the plants, be it coal plant or solar panels or windmills. So when you take that 20% of electricity in the US is produced by renewables, that skews the numbers even more in favor of EVs. So that's, and I'm trying to keep this video as short as possible, so I'm not going to dig any deeper into this. This would be a multi-video series just dealing with this one topic alone. But that's the whole, your EV is propelled by coal argument. There is some credence to it, but again, an EV is roughly twice as clean as a gas car per mile driven when you take the numbers into account. So the next most common objection that I hear from EV haters is that there's strain in the power grid. So this is a very easy one to deal with, but it happens to be something that a lot of people just don't research. They go, well, you know, there's all these EVs, and you know, my gosh, if everybody had an EV, the power grid would go down. Ah, you know, everyone freaks out. Well, there's a few things that people just don't seem to take into account. One major thing is the fact that people are already using a lot of power during the summer, especially to power air conditioners. And you couple that with the second point, which is that the majority of EV charging is done overnight when you're not using air conditioning, when the power grid is actually quite relaxed. In fact, if you research this, there are baseload power plants, there are peaking power plants, and then there are also sort of mid-load power plants. And peaking plants will run for those few hours a day when power usage is peaking, just to add extra power to the grid. And then there are middle-sized power plants, or I forget the term for it, that will run during, you know, the heat of the day, whatever, when power is sort of generally up, mid-load plants. And then there are base load plants that basically run, you know, full power 24/7 to give the base load to the grid. Those base load plants, overnight, there's so little power used that in many areas, base load power plants have extra power just to blow that's not even being used. In fact, there are some municipalities that will even pay people to burn electricity in the middle of the night because they're just wasting power as heat, because those base load plants are running all night long, whether people are using the power or not. So EVs are primarily charged overnight. There's only a little bit of charging that's done during the day. So the fact that EVs, you know, if we increase the number of EVs that are out there, it isn't straining the grid as much as you might think. Now, there is an exception to this, and that is when you're traveling state to state in an EV, you're going to use the public charging network. Like with a Tesla, I'll use the Tesla supercharging network and that. And so that's power that's being used during the day. But that's the exception, not the rule. In fact, most people recognize that EVs aren't traveled with state to state as much as gas cars. So that's really a kind of a small amount of EV charging use. Now, here's some other numbers for you as far as the charging load on the grid. The average home is 2,000 square feet. The average 2,000 square foot home, the air conditioner consumes 3,500 watts when it runs throughout the heat of the day. Now, to charge an EV, most EVs have 7,000 watt onboard chargers. So an EV will draw about twice as much energy while charging as an air conditioner will use while running. So it is true that an EV will draw twice as much power to charge as your air conditioner does to run. However, I go back to EVs are typically charged overnight, and let's look at it this way. During the heat of the summer, most everybody's running their air conditioning to cool their house, especially through the hotter months, and the grid can support this. So that means if 50%, and let me tell you, we are many, many, many years away from 50% of people owning EVs and using them every day. But if 50% of people had EVs and charged them overnight, which again, you're driving your car during the day, you're going to charge it at night. Electric rates are cheaper at night, so people are encouraged to charge overnight. You could have 50% of the population own EVs and charge them overnight before we would even equal where we're at now with air conditioners running during the day. So it's not as bad as people think. And one thing that I haven't even crunched the numbers on is the rate of solar adoption versus the rate of EV adoption. I know in my area, there are more houses that have solar panels on the roofs than there are houses with EVs in the driveways. So at least in my little nucleus, now again, I haven't researched this, maybe I'll do a separate video on this, but in my area anyway, there are I see more solar panels being installed on houses than I see new EVs on the road. And this could be my bias. I haven't really written the numbers down, but let's say I'm wrong, and let's say it's only half. So let's say for every EV that's sold, there's a half of one house. Or for every 2 EVs that are sold, there's one house that adds solar. Still, the fact of the matter is that solar panels are being installed on people's homes at a greater rate, and renewable energy power generation, commercial power generation, is increasing in percentage. And it's my prediction that we will see as much renewable energy production increase as we see EV production increase. At least, again, that's my prediction. So as EVs are adopted more and more and more, the power grid, again, people are charging at night, not so much during the day when the power grid has surplus power anyway. More people are putting solar panels on their roofs, which eases or eliminates that whole worried about EVs issue. And commercial renewable power generation is on the rise, and that's going to offset it as well. So it's my prediction that the power grid will not see any appreciable increase, and in fact may see a decrease in usage throughout the nation as a whole. California is a unique state where it's primarily politically liberal, and they encourage EVs, and they happen to be one of the hottest states and one of the wealthiest states, so people will tend to crank their air conditioning and so that leads me to my next discussion point, which is about why is California, and I'm in Northern Illinois, I don't live in California, so I have no axe to grind to defend California, but California is telling people to buy EVs but then won't let them charge them. That's a lie. The reality of the fact is, yes, California is encouraging EVs more than any other state as far as I know. And recently California sent out a thing that basically said, look, during peak heat hours, please minimize your AC use. It wasn't just electric cars, but please minimize your AC use and EV charging. And the reason they brought that up is because air conditioning use and charging electric cars happen to be the 2 highest power consumption items that people would normally have in their lives. And beautiful Model X there. So yes, that was a request. It wasn't a mandate, it was a request. And it was just, please minimize this during the peak power consumption hours, the heat of the day. But that really only affects AC use, not so much EV charging, because I go back to EVs are charged overnight. They're charged overnight. And so that mandate, that request, doesn't really affect the vast majority of EVs that are being driven because they're being charged overnight. And the most popular and common EV, especially in California, is a Tesla. Teslas are 300-mile range cars. Now on the expressway, the range is less, maybe 240 or something like that. But, around the bulk of people's driving, it's 300 miles of range. So, and you're not driving that many miles. The average commute per day, the average American commutes 40 miles per day. So that means that the average Tesla owner has 6-7 days worth of commuting on one charge. So it's not like they charge overnight, run out of charge by 10 a.m. and then have to plug in during the day. No. The few people doing state-to-state driving may have to charge during the day, but that's more the exception than the rule. So, so that's another point. Let's see here. State-to-state travel. So I just touched on this a tiny bit, but let's flesh it out a little bit further. So state-to-state travel, with people will, haters will hate on EVs and say, well, you can't vacation in the car, you can't travel with it. Everyone panics. Well, a couple thoughts on that. First, yes, there's some truth to it is more convenient to travel with a gas car than it is with a pure electric car. I'll say that right off the bat. That's a concession that I will make for sure. Now with a Tesla, there's not as big a difference as you might think. We've traveled with both, I've owned 2 Teslas, as I said earlier. My wife and I have traveled out of state many times between both the Teslas that we've owned and used the supercharger network. We've only had 2 instances where we had a snafu with a charger, but there's always many stalls. So twice in about 40-50 times we've supercharged. I've backed into a stall and the plug didn't work. Well, one time it didn't work. One time it was charging slower than I wanted, so I moved to a different, just pulled the car forward, moved to the next one over, and it worked fine. So generally speaking, superchargers are reliable. I've had several gas pumps not work at gas stations too, so that's a thing. Yeah, it takes longer to charge a Tesla than to gas up a gas car. My math is about 10% longer to get to a destination out of state because of charging stops than gassing up. So, but it is less than half. It's roughly a third, at least the math that I've done, of a third of the cost to charge an EV on a trip versus purchasing gas. Now that fluctuates with the price of gas, the price of electricity, and all that. But it's far cheaper to charge an EV when you're traveling. So the fact that you wait a little bit to charge is offset by the per mile expense. So that's another thing. Now, now that's a Tesla. So Teslas are really easy to travel in, and charging stations are not 300 miles apart. Now they used to be, they used to be about 150 miles apart, and so you really had to plan to make sure you made it to your charging stop. It's not that way anymore. Tesla charging stops are, I don't know, 50 miles apart or something. They're not as close as gas stations, but you've got plenty of spots you can stop to charge. That's no longer an issue anymore, that there's not enough charging stops. Oh, and their chargers, public chargers and Tesla chargers, they're being built prolifically around the nation. So that's only improving as time goes on. With a non-Tesla, yes, it's more inconvenient to travel, and I will give you that. So if you've got, say, Ford Mach-E or Volkswagen ID, one of the electrical. If you've got a non-Tesla electric car, it is more difficult to, you have to find charging stops. The public chargers sometimes don't want to sync with the car properly or accept your credit card, whatever. There can be, I heard the term, it's the Wild West out there when it comes to public charging, and that is very true. That is very true. There definitely is an aspect of using the public charging system for non-Teslas that can be a little bit quirky. So yeah, there's some truth there, but you can travel. Well, and I'll say this: back in the '80s, people that owned diesel cars, I knew people that owned diesel Volvos and Mercedes-Benz and stuff, and they would talk about how hard it was to find gas stations to gas up their diesel car. A lot of diesel truck stops didn't want cars there and whatever, and so diesel owners coped, and that's kind of the way non-Tesla EV owners are dealing with it right now. It's a little bit frustrating, it's a little bit annoying to find public chargers to use when you travel state to state, but there are a lot of people, a lot of YouTube channels that explain the ways around this, even with short-range EVs. We have a Mini Cooper SE pure electric. It's rated at 114 miles of range on a charge. It's actually, we average about 145 miles on a charge. But state-to-state traveling with that car might be harder, but there's a number of YouTube channels that have done it, have traveled 500-600 miles, stopping every 90 miles or whatever to charge the car, which I wouldn't want to do personally, but it can be done. But again, I will readily admit that there is some truth to it's tougher to travel state to state in an EV. But I'll also throw this at you. Not very many households have only one car. The vast majority of households have more than one car. So you have your gas car or your hybrid or whatever to do state-to-state driving in. We own many cars. We have gas only, we have hybrid, we have plug-in hybrid, and we have EVs in our household. We choose whatever car works best for us, and that brings me to our next point, and that is that the haters need to stop cherry picking and arguing the pluses of gas cars against the negatives of EVs. We need to take the entire subject matter in, as a whole. So people will say the gas, you know, the gas proponents and EV haters will say things like, well, you can't travel in an EV. You can travel great in a gas car. And that's the only point that they'll bring up. Well, how about things like maintenance cost? How about things like per mile operating cost? You know, or they'll say an EV costs more to buy. Just buy a gas car. It's so much cheaper. Well, again, how about per mile operating cost? How about maintenance cost? The haters will always take the one positive of a gas car, or they'll say, oh, I love the you know, the visceral impact of the engine and the shifting. And, you know, honestly, I do too. I'm much more of a mechanical guy than an electrical guy. But they ignore the serene, quiet aspect of owning an EV. Again, owning an EV, EVs are very serene. EVs are fast. The throttle response is crazy high. I mean, they're very sporty cars. And so the EV haters really need to take into consideration all of the parameters of all vehicles, not just, you know, well, let's argue the plus of one. That's kind of like me saying, well, you know, EVs are cheaper per mile to operate, therefore gas cars are worthless. Well, that's arguing only one point, the plus of an EV versus the negative of a gas car. And I don't do that, and I don't know EV proponents that do. So that's another point. So battery longevity and battery disposal is another big one that's brought up. The landfills are going to get full of batteries from EVs. You know what? That is the biggest crock in the world. A couple of things for you. The vast majority, high 90s percentile of EV batteries that have ever been produced for EVs, and bear in mind, EVs have only been on the road for a few years, but the vast majority of EV batteries are still in their cars, still being used. The vast majority of them. There was all this panic. There were all these recycling programs that were implemented that turned out to be a waste of public taxpayer dollars to implement these recycling programs for EV batteries, because you were just not seeing these EV batteries show up in landfills. For one thing, EVs have very advanced battery management systems that extend the longevity of the battery pack way further than was initially assumed it would. Also, what people don't seem to, the EV haters don't seem to realize is when an EV, let's say you crash an EV and the battery is still fine, there is a DIY market for used EV batteries for people converting cars. Nissan Leaf batteries, Chevy Volt batteries, Tesla batteries. In fact, a crashed Tesla carcass is worth a lot of money because people want that battery out of it for their EV conversion. Also, the solar panel and windmill industry oftentimes will gobble up EV batteries for stationary energy storage. Let's say an EV battery has lost 20% of its original capacity and it's annoying in a car because you're not getting the range you once did. Well, that's fine because the solar industry doesn't care if the battery weighs too much. It's just going to sit on the ground and use it for energy storage. So there's a secondary market for these EV batteries. Also, an EV battery, people will scream and cry over the fact that, oh, you know, an EV battery is toxic. It's toxic. Well, okay, if you discharge a lithium battery down to 0 volts, it becomes, for the most part, very benign, and you can just throw it out. A lot of people don't realize that. It's when it's holding a charge that it's toxic and dangerous, because that's when they can burst into flames. So, and look at the fact that, good grief, you put a gas car in the junkyard and the engine's toxic. It's leaching oil into the groundwater, and there's all kinds of cleanup problems around junkyards because of all the oils and whatnot from gas cars that's seeping into the ground. So gas cars are toxic also. Now, I mentioned fires before, and this is brought up all the time. You know, electric car fires, you know, and everyone screams about it. If you do the research, EV fires are extraordinarily rare, but the news media picks up on it, and it becomes, you know, front page headlines when an EV bursts into flames. But you never hear about it when a gas car starts on fire. There are thousands of times more gas car fires than there are EV fires. I drove past one yesterday. I was up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and there's a car on the side of the road. The front half of it was burnt to a crisp. Big burn stains on the ground. The metal's all warped and melted down. So gas cars burst into flames way more often than EVs do. So the whole EVs burst into flames thing, that is a crock. Actually, that's an argument for EVs, not against them, because again, EVs will burst into flames far less common or often than a gas car will. Now, I will say this, when an EV starts burning, it's harder to put the fire out. You can foam a gas car and although gasoline fires are very difficult to put out, but it's even harder to put out an EV fire. Municipalities are learning better ways to put them out, but that is one thing, that when an electric car starts burning, it's much harder to put it out. So, but the fires are far less common. Vehicle longevity and vehicle maintenance. So I haven't crunched the numbers nationwide. I spent more time researching the charging costs and whatnot this morning when I was researching this. But I can tell you from my own experience, if you take all of the vehicles that I personally have owned and the maintenance cost, there are, every vehicle I've owned, including my EVs, have required some maintenance. But what I want to do is eliminate the maintenance for just, wheeled vehicle items, like wheel bearings, tires, that kind of thing. I want to eliminate suspension. I want to eliminate those repair costs from the equation of, the difference in maintenance costs between a gas car and an EV, because, suspension and wheel bearings and that don't care which propulsion system is moving the car. They're just there to support the weight and move it down the road. So, but when you look at the propulsion system, I've driven, again, about 250,000 miles in EVs, and I've only ever had one electric drivetrain related problem with one of my EVs ever, and that wasn't even an issue, really. But I'm going to bring it up just for, transparency here, full disclosure, and that was my previous Model 3. The charge port door went bad and didn't want to open, or when I'd be driving, it would open itself. But that didn't prevent me from using it. I could pull it open manually and plug in, and I did that for a few months until I replaced the charge port door mechanism, which I replaced on my own, by the way, with a used one on eBay, and it was easy to do. I didn't have to bring it to Tesla to do it. But a gas car doesn't have that, but gas cars do have gas doors, and I know several people that have had those not work. But aside from that, I've never had a battery issue, a battery management system issue, a motor inverter issue, or a motor issue, or any kind of drivetrain breakdown on any of the EVs I've owned. And again, I've put 250,000 miles on electric cars, and I've never had an electric propulsion system problem in one of my electric cars, ever, period. I've had steering rack problems in an EV. Again, just a car, it's a steering rack, has nothing to do with the fact that it's electric. I've had wheel bearings. Here's one thing, though, that a lot of people don't realize. Brakes. I've never had to put brakes on one of my EVs. My last Tesla had 111,000 miles on it, and the brakes had 30% wear on them. Why is that? Because with electric cars, when you let off the accelerator, regen happens. My feet are off the pedals, 35 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour, 15, and we're down to a dead stop. Never touch the brakes at all. With electric cars and hybrids also, you have regen braking, which takes kinetic energy and runs the electric motor backward, still running the same direction of rotation, but it turns it into a generator and forces charge back into the batteries to slow the car down, so the friction brakes are barely used. So with a gas car, you have brakes that need to be replaced pretty regularly, and you pretty much never have to do that in an EV or a hybrid even, really. So that is one maintenance cost that is better on an EV as well. But with gas cars, I have replaced over 250,000 mile duration for my business. I've had transmission go out, I've had multiple radiators, I've had alternators, I've had fuel injectors, I've had ignition coils, exhaust system. Catalytic converter by itself is stupidly expensive. I've had fuel pump, problems. I mean, you name it. I could keep going. You want me to keep going? I could keep going with the extremely long list of breakdowns for the gas propulsion system in gas cars for the 250,000 miles I drove gas cars before I started driving EVs. So now, here's another one. Let's look at cost. EVs are expensive, no doubt about that. Although you can get lesser cost EVs these days, but EVs do outcost gas cars, and there's truth to that, but that's for the initial purchase cost. It saves a lot of money over time in energy usage. So for instance, my payment on this car is, I believe it's $760 a month. This was a $62,000 car. I traded in my other Tesla on it, and so that was taken as a down payment. But this car cost me, I believe it's $760 a month is my payment. The insurance on this car is about the same as what our other cars are. So $760 a month, not a cheap car payment, granted. But this car saves me roughly $200 per month because of the number of miles I drive. Saves me roughly $200 per month in charge cost versus gas cost on just an average gas car, that 32 mile per gallon gas car. So that would drop my $760 payment down to $560 a month. Huh, that's about the price of, say, a Camry or some other car, if equipped nicely like this car. This is a premium car. It's got high-end sound, and you know, it's full suite of electronics and all that. So if you similarly equip something like a Toyota Camry or a Honda Accord and finance it out, the car payment is going to be roughly the same as my effective out-of-pocket cost for this car when you look at fuel to electric savings. And I'm not just saying it's $200 of gas I'm not buying. I'm saying would have been about $300 per month in gas I would have bought for the other car, and then this car cost me about $100 a month to charge. So my savings between charging cost and gas cost for this car is about $200 a month. And again, that does fluctuate with the price of gas, so bear that in mind. And that's not taking into account the lesser maintenance cost, no brakes and that kind of thing. So overall, this car is less costly to own than that Toyota Camry. Now let's go to resale cost. This is another thing that people are like, nobody wants your used EV. That is a crock. Used EVs sell for a lot of money, especially Teslas. And for whatever reason, Teslas get so much hate. It's not just EVs, it's Teslas in particular. People have a hatred for Teslas, but Teslas hold their value. I spent $62,000 on this car. I could sell it today for $67,000. Now, part of that is the fact that there's a shortage of new cars. So purchasing a new car would take a while, and therefore, you know, so we are at a unique time in history. But my last car was a $50,000 car, and I traded it in with 111,000 miles on it and got $34,000 trade-in for that car. And you know, astounding to me. So EVs hold their value, in Teslas in particular. Now, another thing I want to bring up, which is just sort of a bonus item, is I don't know why Teslas get so much hate. There's this assumption, Model Y. There's, I guess, there's a presumption of arrogance or whatever that Tesla owners have, and I'd say there was some truth to that. Back when the Model S and Model X were the only Teslas out there, there was a sort of an air of superiority that some Tesla owners in some areas, yeah, go ahead, sir, that some Tesla owners in some areas of the country had. There was this you know, air of superiority and pretension. So, but there's still this presumption of pretension that exists out there now. But the fact of the matter is, there's more Model Ys and Model 3s out there, way more than there are Model S and Model X cars in most areas. And people that buy Model 3s and Model Ys are not really pretentious people for the most part. They're not necessarily trying to save the planet or whatever. They're just buying a car they want to buy, and it's just a car to them. So also, Teslas are American-made cars. It's kind of a weird thing. There used to be this big, you know, anti-import car thing. Buy American, buy American, buy American. And it sure does seem like the people that I know that were always screaming buy American are also the ones that hate Teslas with a passion. You know, the Ford pickup truck drivers and whatever, and buy American. Okay, great. This is an American car. So they're made in California, for Pete's sake. I mean, come on, seriously? Why? You know, it's just astounding to me. So what people need to look at is how many jobs are being created by Tesla as a corporation or other EV manufacturers, the reliability of the cars, the per mile expense. You need to look at everything. The negatives to EV ownership, yes, it is more of an inconvenience to travel state to state, even in a Tesla. Now, in a Tesla, it's only a little bit more inconvenient, but it still is inconvenient. I will say my wife is... Well, the battery just went dead in my GoPro, so I just want to wrap this video up. I know that was kind of abrupt, but I want to wrap it up by making a couple quick statements. And that is that, please, if you're an EV hater or if you're an EV proponent and a gas car hater, look at the entire picture. Don't just look at one facet and compare it to others. Look at the whole picture. Look at the entire picture of EV ownership, the entire picture of gas car ownership, and pass judgment that way. Also recognize the fact that no two human beings are exactly the same. Everybody's different. Everyone's needs are different. Their preferences are different. The area they live in is different. So before you hate on an EV, let's take all these things into consideration. And also, let's be patient with each other. Stop yelling and screaming about things and just, you know, recognize the fact that somebody that disagrees with you may indeed have a point, but they may be missing another point as well. But you may have a point and be missing a point as well. I'm the same way. I may be missing certain points also. So anyway, those are my opinions, but a lot of these facts you can look up online, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of debate and discussion in the comments section below. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments section. We are currently shipping the adjustable screen mount kits. They ship within a couple days. So if you want to order one, there'll be a description, a link for discount in the description below for a screen mount kit if you want one. And keep watching the channel. I am filming more videos. I hope to upload 1 or 2 videos a week moving forward. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, sorry for how abrupt this video ended. Just finishing it with my cell phone here. But have yourselves a wonderful day. And as always, stay charged. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye now.